In the lit corridors of a Memphis hospital in the late 1940s, a young mother clutches her newborn, her face etched with exhaustion and joy. Moments later, a stern-faced nurse enters, her demeanor cold and unyielding. Without meeting the mother's eyes, she delivers the devastating news. "I'm sorry, but your baby didn't make it." The mother's world shatters, her cries echoing through the sterile halls. Unbeknownst to her, this was a carefully orchestrated lie. Her child was very much alive, about to be whisked away into a clandestine network that thrived on such deceit. This heart-wrenching scene was not an isolated incident, but part of a widespread scheme that spanned over 2 decades. At the center of this operation was a woman of considerable influence and charm, Georgia Tann. As the executive director of the Tennessee Children's Home Society, Tann presented herself as a benevolent caretaker, dedicated to finding homes for orphaned and destitute children. However, behind this facade lay a darker reality. Tann exploited her position and connections to orchestrate a black market adoption ring. She targeted vulnerable families, often single mothers or those in financial distress, manipulating them into relinquishing their children or, in more egregious cases, outright stealing them. These children were then sold to wealthy families across the country, with falsified records ensuring that their true origins remained concealed. The repercussions of her actions rippled through generations, leaving scars that many still bear today. How did Georgia Tann, a woman entrusted with the welfare of society's most vulnerable, perpetrate such atrocities for so long? What allowed her to operate with impunity? And how did her actions reshape the landscape of American adoption practices? This is the untold story of the nurse who stole babies for 30 years, a chilling account of power, corruption, and the enduring quest for justice. Welcome to True Untold Stories. Here, we uncover the most gripping, shocking, and mysterious true stories that the world needs to hear. From crime mysteries and historical secrets to unbelievable real-life experiences, we bring you true untold stories every single day. So, sit back, relax, and get ready for a journey into the unknown. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. Now, let's dive into today's true untold story. In the early 20th century, America was undergoing significant transformations, both socially and economically. The rapid industrialization and urbanization led to a shift in family structures and dynamics. Traditional extended families began to fragment as people moved to cities in search of better opportunities. This migration often resulted in overcrowded living conditions, financial hardships, and, consequently, an increase in the number of children who were orphaned or abandoned. During this period, societal views on adoption and child welfare were complex and evolving. Children born out of wedlock faced significant stigma, and their mothers were often ostracized. The prevailing belief was that children from impoverished or unwed mothers were better off placed in more respectable households. However, formal adoption processes were not yet standardized, leading to a patchwork of practices across states. Many adoptions were informal, lacking legal oversight, which sometimes resulted in exploitative situations. The early 1900s also saw the rise of orphanages and child welfare organizations. While some were established with genuine intentions to care for destitute children, others operated with less altruistic motives. The lack of stringent regulations allowed certain individuals to manipulate the system for personal gain. One such individual was Beulah George Tann, known as Georgia Tann. Born on July 18, 1891, in Hickory, Mississippi, Tann was the daughter of a prominent judge. Her upbringing was marked by privilege, and she pursued higher education, which was uncommon for women at the time. Initially, Tann aspired to become a concert pianist, but eventually turned her attention to social work. Tann's early career in social work began in Mississippi, where she was employed at the Mississippi Children's Home Finding Society. However, her methods soon came under scrutiny, leading to her dismissal. Undeterred, Tann relocated to Memphis, Tennessee in 1924. There, she assumed the role of executive director at the Tennessee Children's Home Society, a position that granted her significant authority over child placements. Memphis, during this era, was a city grappling with the challenges of rapid growth. Its strategic location along the Mississippi River made it a bustling hub of commerce and culture. However, this prosperity was accompanied by socioeconomic disparities, with many families living in poverty. Such conditions made the city a fertile ground for Tann's operations. Under the guise of providing orphaned and abandoned children with better futures, Tann began exploiting her position. She leveraged her connections with influential figures, including politicians and judges, to facilitate her activities. Her reputation as a pioneer in adoption practices grew, and she was often consulted by notable personalities seeking to adopt children. However, beneath this veneer of respectability lay a network built on deceit and manipulation. Tann's methods included coercing birth mothers into relinquishing their children, falsifying adoption records, and even resorting to kidnapping. Her victims were primarily children from impoverished backgrounds, whom she deemed unwanted or unfit. These children were then placed with affluent families across the country, often without the birth parents' consent or knowledge. The lack of regulatory oversight in adoption practices during this time allowed Tann's operations to flourish. Her influence was so pervasive that she managed to evade scrutiny for over 2 decades, all while amassing considerable wealth. It wasn't until the late 1940s that investigations began to uncover the extent of her misconduct, leading to a scandal that would forever change the landscape of American adoption practices. Georgia Tann's story serves as a stark reminder of how systemic vulnerabilities can be exploited by those in positions of power. Her actions not only caused immeasurable pain to countless families, but also prompted significant reforms in child welfare policies to prevent such abuses from occurring in the future. Georgia Tann's methods of acquiring children were both calculated and ruthless, exploiting the vulnerabilities of society's most defenseless. She employed a network of spotters, including nurses, welfare workers, deputy sheriffs, lawyers, and doctors, who identified potential victims for her scheme. These collaborators would alert Tann to children from poor or unwed mothers, making them prime targets for abduction. One of Tann's early victims was Rose Harvey, a young widowed mother living in Jasper County, Mississippi. In 1922, Tann drove to Rose's cabin and lured her 2-year-old son, Onyx, into her car. Leveraging her father's position as a judge, Tann had legal papers signed declaring Rose an unfit mother, allowing her to place Onyx with an adoptive family. Despite Rose's efforts to regain custody, she was unsuccessful, highlighting the immense power Tann wielded. Tann's operations were further facilitated by societal and legal loopholes of the time. The stigma surrounding unwed motherhood and poverty made it easier for her to justify the removal of children from their biological families. Additionally, the lack of standardized adoption regulations allowed Tann to manipulate the system with minimal oversight. Her connections with influential figures, including judges and politicians, provided a protective shield, enabling her to continue her activities unchecked for over 2 decades. The personal stories of families affected by Tann's actions are heart-wrenching. Mary Reed, for instance, was an 18-year-old who gave birth in 1943. While still under sedation, she was presented with a document to sign by a woman dressed in white. Unbeknownst to her, this paper relinquished her parental rights. By the time Mary realized what had happened, her baby had been adopted out to a family in New Jersey. Despite hiring a lawyer, she never regained custody of her child. Tann's manipulation of the legal system extended to falsifying birth certificates. She altered children's records to make them more appealing to prospective adoptive parents, often fabricating backgrounds that portrayed the children as coming from educated or affluent families. This deceit not only increased the desirability of the children, but also made it nearly impossible for biological parents to trace or reclaim them. The societal and legal environment of the time, characterized by inadequate regulations and prevailing prejudices against certain groups, created a fertile ground for Tann's unethical practices. Her ability to exploit these systemic weaknesses resulted in the suffering of thousands of children and families, leaving a dark legacy that underscores the importance of vigilance and reform in child welfare systems. For years, Georgia Tann's operation grew unchecked, protected by a web of powerful allies who shielded her from scrutiny. She understood that to keep her adoption-for-profit scheme running smoothly, she needed people in high places, people who could manipulate the system in her favor. And she found exactly that in Judge Camille Kelly, a long-serving juvenile court judge in Shelby County, Tennessee. Judge Kelly, seen by many as a respected authority on child welfare, was the perfect accomplice. She had the legal power to remove children from their families, and with just the stroke of her pen, she could declare a child abandoned or neglected, even when that wasn't true. Many poor parents who came to court seeking help left empty-handed, stunned to learn that their children had been taken into state custody. In reality, those children were being handed over to Tann, who had already lined up wealthy families willing to pay for a quick and easy adoption. Once a child was in Tann's custody, the legal system worked against the birth parents. They had little to no way of fighting back. Appeals were dismissed, paperwork was lost, and in some cases, parents were told outright that their child had died, even though the child was very much alive and on their way to a new home under a different name. By the time desperate parents realized the truth, it was often too late. Their child had been given a new identity, adopted by a family across the country, and erased from the records as if they had never existed. But Judge Kelly wasn't Tann's only protector. Memphis was controlled by one of the most powerful political figures of the time, E.H. Crump. Crump was a political boss, a man whose influence extended to the police, city officials, and even state lawmakers. Nothing happened in Memphis without his approval, and Tann made sure she had his favor. Under Crump's protection, law enforcement looked the other way. Complaints were ignored. Journalists who tried to investigate were silenced. The few people who dared to challenge Tann quickly learned that crossing her meant losing their jobs, or worse. With these powerful connections, Tann's adoption network grew into a massive industry. Over the span of 26 years, she trafficked an estimated 5,000 children, possibly even more. The demand for adoptable children was highest among the rich, especially those seeking babies who fit a certain ideal. Wealthy couples from New York, California, and other states wanted children with fair skin, blonde hair, and blue eyes, traits that were considered desirable at the time. And Georgia Tann made sure they got what they wanted. To keep up with demand, she didn't just take children from orphanages or struggling single mothers, she went further. Babies were snatched from hospital maternity wards, sometimes before their mothers had even held them. Young children were taken off playgrounds, disappearing in broad daylight. Parents who left their kids in church nurseries or daycare centers would return to find them gone, with no trace of where they had been taken. Tann even had nurses and social workers on her payroll, bribing them to falsify records and ensure a steady supply of orphans for adoption. And the money poured in. Adopting parents were charged steep fees, often disguised as donations or paperwork costs. At the same time, Tann was receiving state funding for running her orphanage. She was profiting on both ends, getting paid to take in children, then making even more by selling them to the highest bidder. Her wealth grew, allowing her to live in luxury, while the children she stole suffered in silence. Despite all this, she managed to keep her reputation clean for years. She was celebrated as a hero, praised for helping children find better lives with wealthy families. Few people dared to question how she obtained so many children, or why so many birth parents claimed their kids had been taken against their will. But behind closed doors, stories of abuse, neglect, and deception were beginning to surface. Social workers started asking questions. Families who had lost children refused to stay silent. And the carefully built empire Georgia Tann had created was starting to show cracks. The truth was catching up to her, and soon, the world would finally learn just how deep her crimes ran. By 1950, whispers had turned into cries, and cries had turned into demands for answers. For years, Georgia Tann operated with impunity, snatching children from loving families and selling them under the guise of adoption. But the stories of missing children, devastated parents, and questionable court rulings had finally reached the ears of someone with enough power to act, Governor Gordon Browning. Unlike his predecessors, Browning was not under the influence of E.H. Crump's political machine, which had long protected Tann and her corrupt allies. With Crump's grip on Memphis weakening, the political landscape was shifting, and for the first time, Tann's empire was vulnerable. Public pressure mounted as more families came forward, with heartbreaking stories of children who had vanished without a trace. And so, in late 1950, Browning ordered a full-scale state investigation into the Tennessee Children's Home Society. Investigators wasted no time. What they uncovered sent shockwaves throughout Tennessee, and soon, the entire country. At the heart of the scandal was Georgia Tann, a woman who had built an entire industry around the trafficking of children. For decades, she had deceived, manipulated, and outright stolen thousands of children, disguising her crimes as legitimate adoption practices. But behind the smiling photographs of happy families and well-dressed children sent to affluent homes was an ugly truth. One of the most horrifying discoveries was the systematic destruction of records. Tann ensured that no child she placed could be easily traced back to their birth parents. Birth certificates were forged or altered, adoption papers were falsified, and original documentation was lost or destroyed. Even adoptive families were misled. Many were told that the children they received were true orphans with no living relatives, when in reality, desperate parents were still searching for them. Some records that did survive painted a grim picture. They revealed that Tann had taken advantage of vulnerable mothers, particularly single women, widows, or families in financial distress. Many were manipulated into signing documents they didn't understand or were outright lied to, being told their children would be given temporary care, only to realize too late that they had been permanently taken away. Others had no say at all. Many mothers were drugged in hospitals after giving birth, and later informed that their baby had died. But in reality, the child had been whisked away, often within hours of birth, and sold to a wealthy couple in another state. As investigators dug deeper, they followed the money. What they found was just as damning as the missing children. Tann had been running an extremely profitable business. Wealthy couples looking to adopt often paid thousands of dollars per child, under the pretense of legal fees or processing costs. In reality, these payments were nothing more than a direct sale. Meanwhile, the Tennessee Children's Home Society continued to receive state funding, meaning Tann was making money from both sides, getting paid to take in children and getting paid again to sell them. Financial records revealed the existence of secret bank accounts, where large sums of money had been funneled. Investigators traced these funds back to adoption transactions, further confirming what many had long suspected. This was not an adoption agency, but a human trafficking operation disguised as one. But Georgia Tann hadn't worked alone. The investigation quickly turned its focus to Judge Camille Kelly, a longtime juvenile court judge in Shelby County. Kelly had played a crucial role in Tann's operation, using her legal authority to remove children from their parents, often with little to no justification. Under her orders, children were declared abandoned, neglected, or delinquent, labels that allowed Tann to take custody of them and place them with adoptive families without their birth parents' consent. While investigators found no direct evidence of financial transactions between Tann and Kelly, the judge's lifestyle raised red flags. Despite her modest government salary, Kelly lived far beyond her means. She had a luxurious home, a maid, and even a chauffeur-driven Cadillac, extravagances that seemed impossible without outside financial assistance. While she denied any wrongdoing, the evidence of her involvement was overwhelming. But the corruption didn't stop with Kelly. The investigation exposed a sprawling network of people who had helped sustain Tann's criminal enterprise. Local law enforcement had turned a blind eye to missing child reports. Doctors and nurses had played a role by falsely declaring babies dead. Social workers had been pressured into staying silent or complicit. Even some politicians had accepted donations from Tann, ensuring her protection for decades. The public reaction was immediate and fierce. Families who had long believed their children were dead now wondered if they had been victims of Tann's scheme. The newspapers ran headline after headline, exposing the full scale of the scandal. Tennessee residents were horrified to learn that their state had been the center of one of the largest child trafficking operations in American history. The revelations forced the Tennessee Children's Home Society to shut down permanently. But for the thousands of families who had lost their children, the damage was already done. Many would never find their missing sons and daughters. Some children, now grown, would never learn the truth about their origins. And worst of all, Georgia Tann, the mastermind behind it all, would never face justice. Because just as the investigation reached its climax, Tann fell gravely ill. Before she could be charged, before she could stand trial, before she could answer for the pain she had caused, she died of cancer. She escaped justice in life, but her name would be forever associated with one of the darkest chapters in American history. Though the scandal had finally been exposed, its impact would last for generations. Many of the children she had stolen grew up never knowing who they truly were. Some were lucky enough to reconnect with their birth families decades later. Others were left with nothing but unanswered questions. Governor Browning's investigation led to sweeping reforms in adoption laws, closing the loopholes that had allowed Tann to operate for so long. But for many, the changes came too late. The scars left by Tann's actions would never fully heal. And yet, the case of Georgia Tann and the Tennessee Children's Home Society remains a cautionary tale, a grim reminder of what happens when power goes unchecked, when systems meant to protect the innocent are twisted for personal gain, and when justice, for some, never truly comes. In the wake of the 1950 investigation, the Tennessee Children's Home Society was permanently closed, marking the end of Georgia Tann's notorious child trafficking operation. This closure prompted a nationwide reevaluation of adoption practices, leading to significant legal reforms aimed at safeguarding the rights of children and their biological parents. One of the immediate outcomes was the implementation of stricter regulations governing adoption agencies. States across the country introduced more rigorous licensing requirements and oversight mechanisms to prevent the exploitation and unethical practices that had characterized Tann's operations. These reforms sought to ensure that adoption processes were transparent, ethical, and in the best interests of the children involved. Despite these systemic changes, the personal ramifications of Tann's actions persisted for decades. Many adoptees, unaware of their true origins, embarked on arduous journeys to uncover their identities. The destruction of records and falsification of documents by Tann's network made these searches particularly challenging. Some individuals discovered that they had been taken from their biological families under false pretenses, leading to profound emotional and psychological impacts. For instance, some adoptees learned that they had been stolen from their birth parents or that their adoption records had been falsified, obscuring their true identities. These revelations often led to complex feelings of betrayal and loss, as individuals grappled with the reality of their origins and the circumstances that led to their adoptions. Tragically, Georgia Tann died of cancer on September 15, 1950, mere days before the findings of the investigation were made public. Her death allowed her to evade prosecution and escape accountability for her actions. Similarly, Judge Camille Kelly, who had collaborated with Tann, announced her retirement shortly after the investigation, but was never formally charged for her involvement. This lack of legal repercussions for the principal figures involved left many affected families and adoptees without a sense of justice or closure. The legacy of the Tennessee Children's Home Society scandal serves as a poignant reminder of the necessity for vigilance and ethical standards in child welfare practices. It underscores the importance of transparency, accountability, and the protection of vulnerable populations to prevent such abuses from occurring in the future. Reflecting upon this dark chapter in our history, we are compelled to confront the profound lessons it imparts. The tragic saga of Georgia Tann and the Tennessee Children's Home Society serves as a stark reminder of the imperative need for vigilance, transparency, and accountability within systems entrusted with the welfare of our most vulnerable, our children. This harrowing tale prompts us to ask, how can society ensure that those entrusted with child welfare are held accountable? It challenges us to scrutinize and fortify the mechanisms designed to protect children, ensuring that such abuses of power are neither tolerated nor repeated. Amidst the shadows of this grim history, there are rays of hope and resilience. Consider the story of Jack Sanders, a man who, as an infant, was forcibly placed into Georgia Tann's adoption network. Decades later, through unwavering determination, Jack uncovered the truth of his origins. His journey led to a poignant reunion with his biological family, mending the fractures of a past marred by deceit. Jack's story stands as a testament to the enduring human spirit and the unyielding quest for identity and belonging. In closing, while we cannot undo the injustices of the past, we can honor the memories of those affected by committing to a future where every child's rights are safeguarded and those in positions of trust are held to the highest standards of integrity. Let us carry forward the lessons learned, ensuring that such a travesty never darkens our society again. Thank you for watching True Untold Stories. If this story moved you, don't forget to like the video and share it with others. These stories deserve to be heard. What are your thoughts on Georgia Tann's crimes? Let's discuss in the comments. And if you love real stories that uncover hidden truths, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new upload. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and always question the stories that history tried to bury.